It wasn't until German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt visited the site and began digging. They realized what was really at this site.
Shortly before his unexpected death, renowned archaeologist Klaus Schmidt made a chilling confession. Beneath a quiet hill near Şanlıurfa, he claimed, lay something far older and far more dangerous than anything unearthed at Göbekli Tepe.
What he discovered was mind-blowing. After discovering the first T-shaped pillar buried at the site, he soon found more of these massive structures.
It wasn't gold. It wasn't a tomb. It was something the world was never meant to find. The site was called Gürcütepe. On the surface, it looked like nothing, but Schmidt warned it was hiding something buried on purpose.
So it's an unbelievable good preservation of this enclosure, which had been erected by Stone Age people so long ago and which is still existent now here.
Something ancient minds had tried to erase. Then he died, some say too suddenly. But his final words still echo, "You must dig deeper, or everything we know will be built on a lie." Wrong assumptions about Gürcütepe and Göbekli Tepe. For years, scholars and the public alike fell into a pattern of thinking shaped by what was easiest to see. Göbekli Tepe, with its towering T-shaped pillars and commanding presence on a hilltop, became the blueprint for what became the model of what an important ancient site was supposed to look like. Sites that didn't fit this mold were quietly set aside. Gürcütepe, by contrast, seemed too ordinary. There were no monolithic stones rising from its soil, no dramatic views or symmetrical circular enclosures. It lacked spectacle, and so it was dismissed. This was the first mistake. A second assumption soon followed, that ritual and domestic life in the Neolithic were cleanly separated. Göbekli Tepe was quickly framed as a ceremonial center, detached from where people actually lived. The implication was that the builders must have come from elsewhere, perhaps from villages yet to be found. But few considered whether Gürcütepe, lying just beyond Göbekli's shadow, might be one of those very places. Its proximity should have raised questions. Instead, it was ignored, in part because it didn't match the expectations set by Göbekli's grandeur. Then came a third false belief, that if a site lies under a modern city, it is already too damaged to be useful. Gürcütepe, situated just southeast of Şanlıurfa, now sits beneath streets, homes, and shops. Layers of asphalt and concrete have replaced layers of earth. Many assumed that whatever once existed had been lost to development, but Schmidt never saw it that way. In his private notes, he wrote of areas where the archaeology remained intact beneath backyards and side alleys. It was harder to reach, yes, but not erased. A more subtle assumption influenced even professional researchers. They believed Göbekli Tepe was an isolated leap forward, a singular innovation in architecture and spiritual expression. That idea ignored the likelihood that Göbekli was part of a wider cultural landscape, one where multiple sites contributed to and reflected the same transitions. Gürcütepe, with its quieter profile, was rarely seen as part of that network. Yet Schmidt believed its role had simply been misunderstood. And finally, there was the belief that Gürcütepe, if it had value, was a later development, a settlement that came after the age of monumental enclosures had ended. This assumption stripped it of any transitional importance. But Schmidt suspected the opposite. Could these unremarkable mounds reveal how people transitioned from early ritual centers to permanent settlements? And if so, what did Schmidt discover here that he believed would change our understanding of human history? Schmidt's hidden work. The more the world focused on Göbekli Tepe's towering pillars, the more it overlooked places like Gürcütepe. That's exactly why Klaus Schmidt turned his attention there. In 1995, before Göbekli Tepe became a global sensation, he quietly opened trenches at Gürcütepe, just 2 miles away. While others chased spectacle, Schmidt was chasing context. He wanted to understand how these lesser-known mounds fit into the bigger story of early life in southeastern Turkey. What he found wasn't simple or glamorous. At Gürcütepe 1, the soil held a stacked timeline of human presence. Beneath the surface were layers from the late pre-pottery Neolithic, followed by the first signs of pottery. On top of those sat traces from the Hellenistic and Roman periods, proof that this ground had been reused and re-inhabited for thousands of years. It wasn't one clean archaeological layer. It was a palimpsest of daily life, each period pressing down on the last. In trenches at Gürcütepe 2 and 3, Schmidt's team went even deeper. There they found signs of long-term habitation, low stone walls, partitioned rooms, and domestic hearths. These weren't ceremonial structures. They were lived-in spaces, homes, and that made them deeply significant. They offered what Göbekli Tepe didn't, clues about everyday life. This contrast intrigued Schmidt. Could these houses have belonged to the very people who built the great enclosures at Göbekli? Or were they built by those who came later, after the ritual centers were abandoned? It was a quiet mystery, buried in quiet soil. But to Schmidt, it mattered. If Göbekli Tepe showed how early humans gathered for ritual, then Gürcütepe might reveal how they stayed, how they lived, built, cooked, and passed down knowledge. And that, he believed, was the missing piece. Gürcütepe and the everyday lives of the Neolithic. At Gürcütepe, the finds may not have been monumental pillars, but to Schmidt, they carried hints of something just as significant. Among the deposits were tools, groundstone equipment, and symbolic objects that revealed more than simple survival. This included axes chipped from stone, grinding stones worn smooth by use, mortars, and pestles for preparing food. Beads and bracelets hinted at ornamentation, suggesting that even in daily life people expressed identity through crafted items. Could this combination reflect a community that lived permanently rather than one that gathered only for rituals? For Schmidt, the contrast with Göbekli Tepe stood out sharply. Göbekli Tepe had been designed to impress. It was a place where towering stones and animal carvings would draw attention across the region. Gürcütepe, by comparison, seemed bound to everyday life. These differences were not distractions. They were clues that hinted at how life and belief intertwined for the people who once lived here. The discoveries suggested that symbolism at Gürcütepe was woven directly into domestic spaces. Figurines, ornaments, and tools appeared alongside hearths and storage pits rather than set apart in vast ceremonial structures. What did that mean? Was Gürcütepe the work of a different community altogether, or was it evidence of the same society evolving into a new stage, moving away from monumental construction toward permanent settlement? That question became one of Schmidt's deepest fascinations. He saw a society experimenting with both subsistence and expression, balancing survival with belief, and choosing new ways to embed meaning in ordinary life. The findings at Gürcütepe became more than fragments of stone and clay. They were patterns that hinted at cultural transformation. Sadly, Schmidt would not return to pursue those questions further. Yet before his death, he spoke of the site in ways that showed how much weight he placed on these discoveries. In his final reflections, Gürcütepe stood not as a minor excavation, but as a vital key to understanding how the world's first great temples fit into the broader human journey. Discoveries beneath the modern soil. When new trenches were opened at Gürcütepe in 2021, archaeologists knew they were stepping into ground that still carried unanswered questions from Schmidt's time. Could the site reveal more than what he had already suspected? This was the first full-scale work since his early excavations, and for the team, it was more than routine. Much of the site had already been erased by modern development, so every square foot still intact mattered. Their focus turned to the western edge of Gürcütepe 3, one of the few areas preserved well enough to hold meaningful traces. A careful 30 by 30 foot grid was established, and layer by layer, the soil gave up its secrets. The uppermost layer, marked as Layer 1, revealed the outlines of stone-founded buildings with broad rectangular rooms. Some areas appeared open, possibly used as workshops where daily labor unfolded. Hearths, firing pits, and refuse deposits painted a vivid picture of ordinary life. Scattered among the soil were bracelets, beads, pallets, axes, and mortars. Objects used not just for survival, but for crafting and personal expression. Beneath this came Layer 2, offering another chapter in the settlement's history. Rectangular houses with sturdy stone foundations appeared again, this time with partition walls dividing spaces. The hearths were plentiful, echoing with signs of constant use. Figurines shaped from limestone and animal forms added a symbolic layer, while stone vessels and beads hinted at both ritual and domestic life. In one corner, a dense flint knapping dump showed organized tool-making on a scale that surprised the excavators. Step by step, the ground was confirming what Schmidt had always believed. This site had more to reveal. What the stratigraphy revealed. Sometimes the smallest traces in the soil can change how a whole settlement is understood. That became clear when archaeologists uncovered a semicircle of post holes nearby. These impressions, cut neatly into the earth, likely held wooden supports for a light shelter. Could these have been workspaces, open-sided halls, or perhaps storage areas shared by the community? The discovery raised new questions about how flexible life at Gürcütepe might have been. The layers beneath told their own story. Stratigraphy across the excavation grid was crisp and easy to follow, each deposit lying cleanly over the next. Both upper and lower layers revealed similar building styles, but the deeper level contained finds that suggested a slightly earlier occupation. Together, they preserved a record that stretched from the later pre-pottery Neolithic rite into the first appearances of ceramic vessels. For researchers, this was a turning point. The controlled excavation meant that soil samples, ecofacts, and artifacts could be studied with far more precision than in Schmidt's earlier test trenches. Hearth ash, discarded food remains, and tools all gave insight into daily life. Crafts, diet, and settlement patterns could now be traced with far greater clarity. Yet the progress carried a shadow. What survived at Gürcütepe III was shrinking fast, and its survival made the results even more valuable. In this renewed phase of work, the settlement's timeline grew sharper, and part of Schmidt's long-held belief about the site began to take shape.
Shortly after contacting the local museum with his find, he is visited by Klaus Schmidt from the German Archaeological Institute.
How Gürcütepe sustained its people. A settlement can speak through the simplest things left behind, and Gürcütepe does just that. Every tool and fragment unearthed gave shape to a community that knew how to endure. Unlike the towering circles at Göbekli Tepe, this place carried the rhythm of daily labor, and Schmidt saw its meaning unfold in the soil. Could this contrast between the two sites hold the clue to the truth he hinted at before his death? Excavations showed that stone tools dominated the material record. Most were lithics from the pre-pottery Neolithic B period. Byblos and Palmyra-type arrowheads appeared again and again, proof that hunting traditions survived, even as crops and herds became central. Knives and scrapers turned up as well, signs of work tied to plants and animals alike. Schmidt noted how this continuity revealed skills that were never abandoned, even when farming grew stronger. Groundstone tools added another layer. Mortars, pestles, and heavy grinding slabs pointed toward constant cereal preparation. Polished axes suggested woodworking or clearing new ground. There were also stone vessels, some plain, others shaped with more care. Their range hinted at both practical use and perhaps symbolic meaning. Put together, these finds showed a community that balanced farming, herding, hunting, and craft. Animal bones confirmed the same pattern. Sheep and goats were most common. Pigs followed, while cattle appeared in smaller numbers. Some may have served not only as food, but as status symbols or sources of milk and labor. Traces of deer and smaller game proved that wild hunting had not disappeared. The evidence painted a settlement well adapted to life on the land, yet still tied to older ways. And it was here, in these layers of continuity, that Schmidt began to see the outlines of a larger truth he never stopped chasing. Beads and bones of Gürcütepe. A necklace bead or a carved figurine may seem small, but at Gürcütepe, these objects carried weight far beyond decoration. They revealed how its people expressed identity, connected with others, and even hinted at ideas they carried into everyday life. Could these modest finds hold the key to understanding the larger conclusion Schmidt guarded until the end? Personal ornaments stood out in the assemblage. Beads and bracelets crafted from stone and bone were found across the settlement, and a few had been made from materials that did not come from the region. That detail suggested exchange with other communities, a sign that Gürcütepe was not isolated but part of wider Neolithic networks. Some of these ornaments may have been simple adornments, while others likely signaled social roles within the community. As mentioned before, figurines also played a role in this world. Archaeologists identified male, female, and gender-neutral forms, but the most striking were overweight female figures. These were likely tied to ideas of fertility, prosperity, or shared identity. What made them more compelling was their context. They were not discovered in large ceremonial enclosures, but in domestic settings, showing that symbolism here was woven into daily life. This connection to broader Neolithic traditions was not lost on researchers. The types of tools, the presence of herding practices, and the symbolic artifacts all aligned with later phases of the Neolithic in surrounding areas. That link provided a crucial chronological clue. It placed Gürcütepe at a different point in time than Göbekli Tepe, whose monumental enclosures dominated earlier centuries. By the end of the 2021 and 2022 excavations, the weight of both earlier and recent work made it possible to place Gürcütepe more firmly in the regional sequence. The architecture, the toolkits, and the animal remains pointed to occupation in the late pre-pottery Neolithic B and extending into the pre-pottery Neolithic C. Even more telling were finds in the easternmost part of the site, which belonged to the PPNC phase. This mattered because that phase followed the height of monumental traditions in the region. In other words, Gürcütepe's central occupation came after Göbekli Tepe's great stone circles had fallen silent. Some overlap may have existed in the lower layers, but the heart of Gürcütepe seemed younger, and that chronological shift would form the foundation of the truth Schmidt hinted at before his death. The Neolithic shift. What do the walls of a settlement really say about the people who built them? At Gürcütepe, the difference in construction revealed more than style. It pointed to an entirely new way of living. Instead of towering T-shaped pillars carved from limestone and set in sweeping circles, Gürcütepe revealed small, rectangular rooms meant for daily life. These buildings were practical, modest, and built for households rather than massive gatherings. Such a shift in construction style hinted at more than a new way of stacking stones. It suggested an entire society moving away from large communal projects that demanded coordinated labor towards smaller units focused on family and immediate needs. Why would such a change unfold? Researchers have linked it to the wider transformation that swept across the Near East at the end of the pre-pottery Neolithic B. Monumental sites across the region were gradually left behind. Climate shifts may have forced people to rethink how they lived and where they settled. Crops and herds required different conditions, and the limestone uplands no longer offered the same stability they once had. Communities began moving toward fertile plains, where resources were easier to manage and survival less precarious. Gürcütepe fit neatly into this broader pattern. The dating aligned with the evidence. Early pottery fragments were discovered on site, showing that people here had adopted techniques unknown in earlier phases. Tools crafted with advanced groundstone methods reflected a more developed approach to daily tasks. The community's food base was also more diverse, with evidence of crops, livestock, and hunting mixed together. Even the symbolic traditions followed this rhythm of change. The corpulent female figurines uncovered here echoed the cultural language of later Neolithic societies, rather than the striking iconography carved into Göbekli Tepe's monumental stones. For archaeologists, dating is more than numbers on a timeline. It is the lens that shapes how a site is understood, how it connects to neighbors, and what it reveals about the broader human journey. In Gürcütepe's case, the evidence placed it firmly in a transitional period when societies were redefining themselves. They were adjusting not only to new landscapes and resources, but also to new ways of organizing their lives. Klaus Schmidt grasped this significance long before many others. He recognized that Gürcütepe was not a repeat of Göbekli Tepe, but a window into what came after. To him, this site held the key to understanding why the age of great temples faded and what took its place. According to his colleagues, he began forming this conclusion years before his death, quietly building an argument that reshaped the way these settlements are viewed today. Schmidt devoted much of his life to uncovering and preserving this truth. He wanted others to carry forward the work he began, knowing that without his efforts, much of what is now understood about Gürcütepe might never have been possible. And yet, the conclusion he hinted at raises a question. What did Schmidt truly believe this shift revealed about humanity's path? The hidden clues of Gürcütepe. Privately, Schmidt often compared Göbekli Tepe to Gürcütepe, a settlement on the plains that he described as a missing link in the region's history.
In 1994, that excavations would officially begin at the site. German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt was responsible for the first major excavations at the site.
Colleagues remembered him hinting that this smaller site might explain why people stopped building on such monumental scales. In the months before his death in 2014, Schmidt reportedly spoke with unusual urgency. To a colleague, he admitted that he could not keep what he had learned to himself any longer. His concern centered on timing, on the sequence of dates that told a story few had anticipated. For Schmidt, this was the truth he wanted the world to see. The romantic idea of a lost civilization, suddenly vanishing after the height of Göbekli Tepe, dissolved when he examined the layers of Gürcütepe. Instead of mystery, he saw adaptation and resilience. The evidence forced him to reshape everything he thought he understood about the Neolithic. And once he pieced the data together, the picture it formed unsettled long-standing beliefs. The evidence placed Gürcütepe later in time than Göbekli Tepe. Its primary occupation dated to the late pre-pottery Neolithic B and extended into the pre-pottery Neolithic C. This meant that Gürcütepe rose after the grand enclosures of Göbekli Tepe had already ceased to function. That single fact carried weight. It overturned earlier ideas that saw Gürcütepe as the base camp for the builders of Göbekli Tepe. Instead, the site reflected what came after, when people no longer invested their resources in vast ceremonial monuments, but shifted their focus to homes, families, and fertile lowlands. Schmidt viewed this change as a turning point in human culture. To him, it showed that Göbekli Tepe was not evidence of a vanished advanced society, but part of a continuum. Monumental buildings faded, but life continued, reorganized around new needs and priorities. This interpretation reframed the way Göbekli Tepe was understood. For decades, it had been described as proof that humans once built on a grand symbolic scale long before cities and writing. By placing Gürcütepe firmly after that period, Schmidt argued for continuity rather than collapse. The builders did not vanish into mystery. They adapted, creating settlements better suited to their environment and way of life. With this perspective, the end of Göbekli Tepe no longer looked like a sudden break. It became a transition, and in Schmidt's view, that transition could only be grasped by studying the quieter, less spectacular side of Gürcütepe. How Gürcütepe changed human history. For centuries, history books told us that true civilization began after cities emerged a few thousand years ago. Yet the soil of southeastern Anatolia revealed something that overturned that belief entirely. Long before those first cities, two sites stood out with evidence of planned construction, organized religion, and symbolic expression. Göbekli Tepe was apparently the most famous, but scholars could not ignore Gürcütepe as well.
Göbekli Tepe is not simply a temple. It is a marker of a species on the cusp of change.
These places were not outliers standing alone. They forced a deeper look at how early humans lived, built, and believed. When archaeologists carefully dated and analyzed Gürcütepe, it became clear that the path to civilization was not as simple as once thought. Evidence suggested cycles of progress, disruption, and renewal stretching back far beyond written history. What counted as advanced was not always massive stones or monuments. Sometimes it appeared in finely made tools, carefully arranged settlements, or abstract symbols carved into materials that were meant to last. Gürcütepe, once placed alongside Göbekli Tepe, began to show a broader pattern. Humanity was not climbing in a straight line from primitive to advanced. Instead, there were stages of growth, collapse, and rebuilding, each one leaving behind traces of both continuity and change. Could it be that we have overlooked entire chapters of human development simply because they did not fit the expected timeline? For Schmidt, this was not a side note. It was the final piece of truth he worked to share. With recent excavations confirming the dating and sequence, his view now carries even more weight. The Neolithic was never just about monumental architecture. It was about what happened after the stones were abandoned, how communities adapted and redefined survival. The people did not vanish. They adapted. They carried their beliefs into new forms and reorganized their lives to fit new landscapes. This was the shocking truth Schmidt pointed to before his death. And it leaves us with a haunting question. If this fragmentary site can show us so much, how much more might still be waiting in the ground that has already been lost? Despite these findings, the site faces a fragile future. Modern development has already destroyed large portions of Gürcütepe. What remains are scattered fragments, vulnerable to time and construction alike. Without urgent protection, even these surviving traces may vanish, silencing evidence that is vital for understanding this transitional period in human history.